Hello. Now, claiming that Google has run into antitrust trouble would be a mild understatement. Keeping track of the many cases that are open or has been open against Google globally would probably be a full-time job, and I don't think many outside Google's legal department have any kind of overview, and even they are probably struggling. I will try to remedy this by identifying and explaining the cases that I have identified and how they are connected. The latter is not only through what I see as Google motive, but also how enforcers globally take inspiration from each other. In this process, I will also try to explain why the antitrust investigation into Google might represent a shift in how we understand and apply antitrust. Based on blog, press statement, and news article, I have located almost 150 antitrust cases globally. Now, there are undoubtedly more, and some has probably been or potentially been closed, exonerating Google of any misdoing without I notice it. But if we ignore those shortfalls for the moment and try to group the cases based on services, we get some very interesting pattern. Almost two-thirds of the cases pertains to five services, including Search, Android, AdTech, Play, and AdSense. Granted, there are more, but they are, in my opinion, more of a sideshow. One of these are the Jedi Blue, where Google and Meta had concluded a cooperation agreement that probably as an internal joke was named Jedi Blue. No misdeed was found, and the cases has gradually been closed. Other cases are different scrapping issues where Google allegedly is stealing content in defiance of IP rights. Another group is damage claims where the victims want compensation, often based on one of the five core cases. Now, the remainings are challenged to categorize due to limited information. If we return to the court cases, the US ruling from August 2024 has received much media attention, not only for being the first federal US case to succeed against Google, but also due to the enormous payment to Apple for default status on iPhone and the position of a line of top CEOs. However, this should not cloud for how it fit into a larger global picture. Now, you will notice that I have grouped it with the Android cases. The media refers to the case as Google Search or Google One, but it fits better with the Android cases. Moreover, the self-favoring charges were gutted from the case early on, setting it apart from the other search cases, explaining why I find it relevant to submit it with the Android cases. If we focus on the core cases, in reality, only three of them really warrants attention. First and foremost, would it be Google search called shopping in EU, where Google's self-favoring was held abusive in the EU, but not in the US, and even the European cases comes with qualification, as I'll explain later. The EU case was upheld on final appeal in September 2024 and is in principle closed. However, it remains unknown if Google as orderer has terminated the abuse, and we also have some follow-on claims. Looking at the number of jurisdictions that have looked into Google's alleged self-favoring, it appears as everybody wants to investigate this. However, most ends up exonerating Google. Another court case would be the AdTech case. That is a group of cases that could prove much more dangerous from Google's perspective, as I shall explain later. Based on the French decision in the AdTech case, class action has been launched against Google in several jurisdictions where the victim claims compensation. I have information about one in UK and one in Germany, but I believe there's also one in Holland. Moreover, other enforcers have followed suit and opened their own AdTech cases. This includes the European Union and US. The Android cases are also very interesting by opening a window into Google's motive and some of the action taken to pursue this. We'll return to the motive later. So if we focus on the action instead, In the US case that was decided in August 2024, we for instance learned how Google pays no less than 26 billion US dollars per year for being pre-installed on old smartphone. Now, why Google pays so handsomely is something I'll outline later as it pertains to the motive. To understand the cases and the relationship, we first need to understand Google's business case. And yes, I know that you probably know the firm well and what they do, but I don't think you understand the full extent of Google's online empire. I understand Google offers some 271 services as part of a wall-to-wall ecosystem that covers most way of utilizing the internet. Some are very popular and some less in obscurity with few users. Most, if all are available for the price of zero. Now, please notice that I use the word zero and not free because you pay with your privacy. By the way, how did I identify the 271 services? I googled it. To finance this large and free ecosystem, Google distributes online ads, either on content pages with publisher or through sponsored and paid links in the searches. Google is probably the most significant online publisher because it owns YouTube, where ads can be shown. A substantial portion of the ads managed by Google is therefore also published with Google, creating an inherent conflict of interest. We'll look into this when we get to the ad tech cases. Now, content provider upload videos to, for instance, YouTube, which is then monetized by Google. Some of this goes back to the content provider. Full disclosure, I need to tell you that I don't get paid by Google, but I am a content provider. I don't know why Google don't want to pay me, probably because I have too few viewers and subscriptions, but I hope you can help me remedy this. Most of the 271 services are available for the price of zero and therefore not generating any revenue. Nevertheless, they help Google by providing personal data that then can be harvested and monetized indirectly. The question on your mind is probably, how can this be anti-competitive? And why did it took enforcers so many years to learn this? The slow and vague reaction by enforcer has given rise to massive criticism and even a new way of thinking in antitrust. The latter has been referred to as hipster antitrust by its critics. I don't feel this is fair, but the name is catchy. The general perception is that all of this is very new, but that's not true. I will explain why and how most of the discussion reopens and recycles old grievances and discussion. It's also fascinating, but also slightly frightening how the narrative surrounding big tech has changed completely over the last 10 years. Once universally admired, now the CEO of Amazon, Google, Apple, and Google are now referred to as digital bandits or Gang of Four. Now, in case you don't know it, the Gang of Four is usually used as a reference to four Chinese communist leaders that was partly responsibility for the Cultural Revolution and that menace, which took place between 1966 and 1976. It is therefore not a friendly reference. We also have Lina Khan and an epic paper, the Amazon Antitrust Paradox, that was put out in 2017. However, Lina Khan was inspired by Louis Brandeis and his approach to big business in the 30s, seeing them as fundamentally bad and detrimental to competition. Her paper is also a direct reply to Robert Bork's 1978 book, The Antitrust Paradox. Here, Bork rebuts Louis Brandeis' approach and labels it as fundamentally flawed and broken, at odds with common sense and the original intention of Congress when they adopted the Sherman Act in 1890. So, as you can see, we are already way back in time. Now, before I can go into Bork's recommendation, we need to discuss Robert Bork and why some consider him controversial. He's not just an academic scholar. His initial claim to fame goes back to what has been coined the Saturday Night Massacre, which took place on the evening of Saturday, October 20, 1973, during the Watergate scandal. Here, Nixon tried to kill the pending investigation into his alleged crime by firing the special prosecutor, leading to a series of events that made Bork acting head of the Department of Justice. Bork is also known for an unsuccessful Supreme Court nomination, as Reagan nominated him to the vacant seat in 1987. Bork's nomination was unsuccessful, as the Senate would not accept him. Interestingly, one of those who was really in a driver's seat when it came to blocking Bork was at that time young and relatively unknown Joe Biden. So, depending on your political stand, you might see Bork as either the digital version of Darth Vader or He-Man. Also, I've already introduced you to Tree President and a meticulously hardworking law student. You know, the stuff that makes Hollywood film. What did Bork articulate when it came to antitrust? First and foremost, that the object of antitrust enforcement should be consumer welfare, and we should only intervene if there was a real risk that the action was detrimental to consumer welfare. That meant, in practice, we should limit our interest to horizontal cartels, and we should be very mindful of the risk of over-enforcement. Bork's focus was very much on type 1 errors, that is over-enforcement, and the need to limit that. I think that most people at that time agreed with Bork that there was a real risk or a real problem of over-enforcement in US antitrust. Bork's legacy coming out of the 80s was therefore what we can call a minimalistic antitrust enforcement, where enforcer only should intervene in a limited number of situations. Focus should be on avoiding over-enforcement, and there should be high threshold for intervention. Now, this is part of a much larger discussion in the 80s on the role of the state in the economy and the prudency of regulation. I think that other YouTubers have outlined that much better than me, so I recommend checking them out. They are not only highly educational, but they're also quite entertaining. Now, I would imagine that you probably ask yourself, okay, very interesting, but how does this play into Google and its alleged crime spree? To remedy this, we will focus on the case we know as Google Shopping in Europe. It has other names in other jurisdictions, but Google Shopping is the word we use for it. Others would typically call it Google Search. This is a case involving self-favoring, where users are directed to Google's offering at the expense of alternative. I will try to, at my best, reconstruct what Google has done. But in this, we need to be mindful of how it constantly improve and change the algorithm, so you might not be able to replicate it at home. Nevertheless, I will do my best. I will also try to explain Google's motive, why this might qualify it as anti-competitive, but could be challenging to go against under the notion of consumer welfare that emerged out of the 80s and Bork's teaching. When you navigate the internet, you rely on a search engine, but you might not know there are two options available. The first would be a general search. We also call that a horizontal search that essentially covers the entire internet. Google is king of this, and it is Google's ambition to remain king of this, which explains some of the action it has taken. However, you also have an alternative, that is the second option. That is something we call specialized searches or vertical searches, where you only focus on one specific matter. That could be places and events. Google offers specialized search services, but there are alternatives. Let's start by doing a horizontal search to understand the two options much better. Now, if you type in a word or a combination of words, in this case university, a general search service would yield an organic index of hits. We typically call this the blue links, and you can see an example here. The quality of the result depends very much on the algorithm, and the algorithm is constantly improved by tracking what you actually goes for. This creates strong network effects and bandwagon effects. Further to the generic index, some links might be sponsored, creating income from the search engine. If you're looking for something very specific, you can also rely on a specialized or a vertical search where you only look into one subject matter. Here, it could be travel or events. Yelp is a specialized vertical search service that focuses on travel destination and events. Expedia is another one that focuses on hotels and connecting flights. And you can rely on these if you need one specific service. Google also offers specialized searches. Example is Google Images, Google Flight, Google Maps. But generally speaking, this is a highly competitive segment of the economy. We also have a hybrid. In this case, comparison shopping that is neither vertical nor horizontal, but something in between. And it is used once you type in a question which pertains to a product. Comparison shopping can actually display those services directly on your screen, and then you can activate it, go to the merchant and buy the product. This is very useful when you're looking for a product. Personally, I think this is just a specialized search, but the European Commission claim it is not, and I don't feel qualified to challenge that. So let's go with the Commission's position. What is much more interesting is the fact that in contrast to horizontal search, comparison shopping is actually profitable because you can ask for commission for the merchant that you direct traffic to. So it is easy to understand why Google might have an incentive to monopolizing this service, and that is exactly what they are done in the Google Shopping case. More specific, they engage in self-favoring, rather than directing you to the competing comparison shopping. They persistently try to nudge you to their own services by presenting them in a much more attractive manner. Now, let's try to visualize this by returning to Google. Now, when you open your Google search engine window, you get this, and then you can type in your inquiry. If you type in defense attorney, you will get this result, provided that you are in US. Here you can see general search results, sponsored links, and information about famous or infamous defense attorney. Now, to understand why shopping is not only a hybrid, according to the Commission, but also very usefully, let's assume that you are attending an important business event and then you suddenly realize that you are short of a tie. Or if you are a woman, it might be that you are short of appropriate shoe. Now let's stay with the tie and choose a product. In this case, we type in Hugo Boss tie. We still involve several multiple searches. But as you can see, Google offers much more overlapping search results based on a single inquiry. On top, you would see the search result generated by Google Shopping. Now, the problem is that only advertisements that are managed by Google are placed up here, while the competing offerings are referred to the organic blue links at the bottom. Now, this is why Google referred to a service as universal search, and in this disputes the separation between horizontal and vertical searches, and that comparison shopping is something separate, unique. It is all integrated into a single search, which is so much more convenient from an end user perspective. When the European Commission rendered a decision on this in 2017, they not only condemned Google's action, but they also tried to explain why this was actually anti-competitive and abusive. More specifically, the European Commission explained that it was abusive when only Google's own offering were allotted and displayed with premium placement in the top, and the competitors was downgraded to the bottom because all of this could actually drive traffic away from the competitor. It even was suggested that this was done maliciously. Now, Google dispute any malicious intent, but it is not possible to deny that only Google's own offering are placed at the top and that this has consequences in terms of traffic. The question is, of course, should we accept this as anti-competitive and detriment to the consumer welfare? And as I shall explain, I'm somewhat inclined to say no to this. Let's go back to our lawyer example. Assume that you need a criminal defense attorney. You just Google it. You will get the boxes, including some pictures and address and a map. And I really think this is highly useful. Technically, you could just drop into the taxi, give the address, ask to be taken there as fast as possible, and ideally ahead of the police officer just behind you. You can then call in advance and have the lawyer standing ready outside. So it is obvious that this is very useful and very helpful. We could also look at it in terms of innovation and generation. If you go back in time, you might actually know or recall how unhelpful and unintelligent the internet was. You couldn't really search anything initially. You were confined to a number of boxes where somebody else has made the index. And it is obvious as time has gone by and Google has come around, it has been so much more easy to access the internet. And it could therefore be coined that we have generation, first, second, and third generation, and we constantly are offered much better services. And Google is, of course, very much responsible for this. We can also make the relatively simple argument that Google needs to make a profit. Most of the things Google are offering is sold for the price of zero. It's not free because you pay in terms of privacy, but you don't pay any monetary direct payment, and it is therefore in all practical purposes free. So how does Google recoup this? Well, they do that by selling ads, and they have a financial interest in directing you to ads that are paying them. I also have some issues with labeling self-favoring as abusive in itself, because self-favoring is just simply such a normal thing to do in digital economy that it would be problematic to claim it to be unusual and not competition on the merits. In a situation where you need to list somebody, it would be unexpected and nobody really think they would be required that you list anybody else than yourself on top. So I think that there are some really strong arguments against accepting self-favoring as abusive. Now, we could also lawyer up and take a much more legal approach to the case. By the way, I hope you enjoyed Suit as much as I have. Now, I don't think the ending is realistic. Harvey Specter is not marriage material, but that's a different story. Now, if we go back to 2012, the US Federal Trade Commission did not go forward with a case against Google on essentially the same grievances as I've just outlined. So when the Federal Trade Commission closed the case in 2013, it in principle exonerated Google of any wrongdoing. When the Federal Trade Commission closed the investigation, we didn't understand why, because initially only a very short press statement was available. However, later some of the documents and eventually the full documents was released, and here we can actually get a much better understanding on what happened. Because the FTC did actually see a problem. They did actually identify anti-competitive behavior, but they did not think they could build a case because what Google was engaged in was not anti-competitive under US antitrust. Or perhaps much more precisely, it did not qualify as anti-competitive under the consumer welfare standard and the notion of competition law as proliferated by Robert Bork. Now, Robert Bork didn't make it to US Supreme Court, but other equally conservative forces did, and much of Bork's teaching has been adopted and incorporated into modern competition law. This also explains why the European Commission tried to close the case against Google, subject to commitment, where Google made some adjustment, no less than 3 times, because the Commission was equally uncertain on the ability to build a case against Google, because what they did didn't really qualify it as abusive under traditional understanding of the concept. It wasn't until the arrival of a new chief enforcer in Europe that things really started to change. The first element that happened was actually an adjustment of the theory of harm, downplaying the self-favoring and including other grievances. Regardless of restructuring the case, including more grievances and gutting a lot of the stuff to make the case more simple, we can still see that DG.com struggled to build a case. How can we see that? Well, we can see it if we look into the theory of harm as offered by DG.com in the decision as rendered in 2017. According to DG.com, it's abusive when only Google's own offering comes with pictures and info boxing, while the competing offerings are referred to the organic blue links. The problem is that this does not make sense. Now, what I think DG.com is trying to establish is that it is not abusive per se to blend search result nor to apply adjusting mechanism. However, it can be abusive if this is done maliciously for the purpose of downgrading competing results. Now, to understand why Google did this, why they might have acted maliciously, we need to jump forward to the Android case, because even though DG.com tried to explain it in Google Shopping, they didn't really do a very good job. Now, if we go to the Google Android, that is not only in the European Union, but also in US, we can see how Google has tried to create a default installation status for its services on smartphone. They have done that by essentially paying the manufacturer of the phone. How it exactly is done differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but across all of them, there are money involved. The most obvious examples uncovered in the American cases where we understood how Google actually paid $20 billion to Apple per year for being available on iPhones. Returning to Google Shopping, DG.com claims that Google's self-favoring is anti-competitive and detrimental to the interest of the consumer. DG.com claimed that the abuse served two objectives. The first was to monopolize a more profitable service, that would be comparison shopping. The second was to prevent comparison shopping from serving as a jumping off point for attack on general searches. Returning to Google Android, we can see the same defensive motive, that is the second motive for the Google Shopping, because Google was very much afraid that it could lose its search monopoly and position as the internet gatekeeper if user migrated from stationary PC to mobile devices. Okay, that requires some comments. Since the introduction of the modern smartphone in 2007, users has gradually migrated from using stationary PC as point of departure for internet searches to mobile devices. Since 2015, half of all searches have originated from mobile devices, making it obviously critical for Google to be the preferred option here too. DG.com therefore concluded in the Android case that this had actually motivated Google to acquire and aggressively roll out the Android operating system. The Android operating system is available for, once again, the price of $0 for smartphone devices, only subject to the pre-installation of certain Google offering, that is searches and Chrome. Now, I'm not qualified to evaluate if that is the motive, but I think that DG.com did a very convincing job in explaining it. I also believe, which I shall explain later, that this is actually a motive that goes much broader and Google is actually driven by that, and I also believe that other than Google's are driven by that, and that is the explanation why so many of them have offered and deployed large online ecosystem. So across both cases, we can see how Google engaged in different abusive action for the sole purpose of protecting its core business, and its core business is of course selling advertisement and functioning as the internet gatekeeper. Now it actually becomes interesting because across the year, the fear of losing business due to migration has transcended into what often is referred to as the browser war. Browser War 1 and 2 are the best known, and Google Android would then pertain to Browser War 3. It was a war that you never heard of because Google managed to win it preemptively. In case you have never heard of the browser wars. Now, Browser War 1 is the best known and best documented, and it is generally known as Department of Justice versus Microsoft in the US and Microsoft 1 in the European Union. In the Department of Justice versus Microsoft, Microsoft had integrated Explorer into Windows to eliminate Netscape. In Microsoft One, it was Media Player that came pre-installed. Now, why did Microsoft do that? Well, they did that because Bill Gates, as early as 1995, understood how the internet could change everything, including bringing about a shift from buying PC operating system, which was dominated by Microsoft, to downloading from the internet. Should this happen, Microsoft's core business would be eliminated. Why do we know that? Well, we know that because Bill Gates outlined it all in an internal Microsoft memo called the Internet Tidal Wave memo, which was uncovered later when Microsoft was made subject to charges and Bill Gates was interviewed during this. Microsoft's ambition to dominate the internet has been turned into a movie. It's called Antitrust. I don't think it's a very good one, but it does shows the negative attention allotted to Microsoft and Bill Gates in the 90s. Speaking of movies, I would be much more inclined to recommend BlackBerry. Besides being much more entertaining, it also shows how smartphone changed everything and how quickly a dominant position can be created and lost in the digital realm. In case you don't know it, BlackBerry is about the mobile phone that was slightly smart before we had the smartphone, and it thereby somehow translates to what I have called the browser war 3. Returning to Google Shopping, the General Court, which was asked to review DG.com's decision, upheld most of DG.com's finding, but also added some notable observation. The most essential of this was correcting what I believe was a badly drafted attempt of defining the abuse. The court did accept that the combination of self-favoring and the motion of competing offering could be abusive. Not necessarily in general, but at least in the specific case where traffic remains essential for the competitors and users rarely venture beyond the first 4 to 5 results. Regarding the motive, only the first was accepted, but on balance, DG.com never invested that much energy into substantiating the second, so not having it confirmed on appeal was not a big deal. In particular, as the motive was accepted in Google Android, thereby giving credibility to it. The General Court's ruling in Google Shopping was appealed to the Court of Justice, that is EU's highest judicial authority, and in September 2024, the court upheld the General Court's finding. The court did not agree in all of the explanation and rationing, but the finding, that is that there was an abuse, was confirmed. This means that competition can actually be applied against anti-competitive behavior in the digital sector, provided enforcers actually understand what to look for. Perhaps even more important, Google Shopping and the ruling does not establish self-favoring as abusive per se. It might be, but that remains to be settled. With the benefit of hindsight, it even becomes understandable why the Federal Trade Commission had very little appetite for a high-profile case they were struggling to understand, struggling to build, and not really convinced they could win. It even explained why the European Commission chose to what we can call adjust its theory of harm in 2014. In particular, the American Federal Trade Commission would have been presented by a very high burden in terms of building a case, and it is highly doubtful that they could have succeeded based only on a self-favoring theory of harm. Taking a broader perspective and looking forward, it is notable how all big tech companies have developed and deployed very large online ecosystem, often offered more or less for free. Personally, I think a driving motive behind this is the fear of user migration. Google might be the king of ecosystem, but Meta is a prima facie example of company facing user migration, which could have dire consequences because progressively people are leaving Facebook. Meta probably hoped to nudge them in the direction of another Meta offering, thereby securing legitimacy at a group level. This might also explain why Google are so focused and so interested in offering operating system to any kind of device connected to the internet. Now, granted, Google probably also see a potential business case in this, but it is very tempting to see it as part of the browser war, in particularly as it comports very nicely with the larger picture where internet is built into devices and these gradually become gatekeepers to the internet. This also potentially explains why Google was affected so negatively when they lacked a proper response to Microsoft OpenAI, which was launched in early 2023. OpenAI could replace the need for a search browser and a search engine, thereby potentially dethroning Google as the internet gatekeeper. Should this happen, Google might also lose control over the very substantial advertising revenue that is derived from this. So, as you can see, there's much more at stake with the proliferation of OpenAI than you might think, and some companies have much more skin in the game than others. So, you might joke and find it funny, but I can assure you the company like Google's are not laughing. They are very much scared about the idea that OpenAI could change things. I initially promised that I would revert to the AdTech investigation and why these potentially could be very dangerous for Google. Now, Google Shopping and Google Android, which we have already talked about, established principle limiting Google. But when it comes to the underlying businesses, they essentially pertain to services that already are successfully monopolized and browser wars they have won. We should not forget that Google's core business is its distribution of online ads. Very simplified, online ads can be segmented into searchable and non-searchable apps, where the latter are also referred to as display ads. Searchable ads are Google's traditional business, where ads and search results are blended in and provided in the blue organic link or somewhere around it. Now, looking forward, it appears that a much more interesting and booming market segment is actually what we call non-searchable or display ads. Because as you can see here, all online ads are booming, but apparently display ads is booming much faster than everything else. Ad tech services are used to connect two groups of customers. On the one hand, that would be those who own a domain, we call them publisher, and the other hand, that would be those who want to run an advertisement campaign. They bid and the bids are cleared over an ad exchange, which would be akin to a traditional marketplace or stock exchange. Google serve both groups, that is the publisher and the advertiser, but Google also run the biggest ad exchange and DG.com and other things that Google persistently self-favor its own accents to the detriment of, well, the users, which would be publisher and advertiser. This is a case to watch for. Now, as always, when I do my video, I have listed all the resources I have relied upon. And as I do not believe that self-favoring is abusive in isolation, I have allowed mostly to refer to my own papers. Should you have questions, feel free to reach out. And yes, I would be available as a consultant if you want to turn this into a movie or a Netflix miniseries.